Hi everyone, I'm Cody Rue. This is the Church of Logic. Today I'm sadly unaccompanied, but I'm going to talk about something pretty fun. I'm going to talk about the Collatz conjecture. So, the Collatz conjecture is this well-known and tantalizing conjecture in mathematics. It says something about the following operation. If you take any positive number, like 7, and you repeatedly apply the following operation. You take the number, and if it's even, you divide it by 2, and then you continue on with that. And if it's odd, you multiply it by 3, you add 1, and then you continue the operation. So in the case of 7, you'd multiply it by 3, you get 21. You'd add 1, you get 22. Then you continue. 22 is even, so you divide it by 2, you get 11. And then you start over, you multiply it by 3, you get 33. You add 1, you get 34, etc. I bet you've immediately noticed that whenever you do the 3 multiplication plus 1 operation, you get an even number, so you're going to divide by 2. Sometimes people kind of add that immediately in the problem statement. Instead of multiplying by 3 and adding 1, you multiply by 3, add 1, and divide by 2. That's the whole step. The question is, you start with any number, you do this operation, right? The number grows a little bit, then it comes down as you divide by 2, and then maybe it grows again. The question is, will it eventually stop growing and fall down and hit the number 1 at some point? People believe this conjecture is true. We've tested it for a long line of numbers. And one thing that's unsettling is that mathematicians know how to prove things like that once and for all. Tons and tons of examples of things they can prove, including non-intuitive things. But this one they can't. They don't know whether it's true or not. And not only do they not know, it seems really hard. They've thought about it really hard. When this question started becoming popular, this was, during the Cold War. I think it was the 50s. People suspected that it was a plot by the communists, that the communists had come up with this question designed to occupy the minds of so many mathematicians, fruitlessly, instead of doing more productive things for, I guess, the war effort. At any rate, people really tried to think about this question hard, and because it's so elementary, a lot of amateurs have thought about this question, but, realistically, this question is incredibly hard and will occupy mathematicians for, years and years and possibly centuries. I don't want to talk that much about this question. This isn't, the Church of Numbers. Let's talk about logic. John Conway in, I should have checked my dates. John Conway in the 70s, I think, came up with an interesting observation concerning this problem. But that observation, to explain really what it was, I'm going to have to take some side steps, take some distractions. And basically there are 2 distractions here. The first one is something about computability, and then the second one is a game. And John Conway was a mathematician, but he was also fascinated by games. And so I'm going to explain what that game is and how it's relevant. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what Conway at the time called Minsky machines, but today we would call those register machines. What's a register machine? It's just a mathematical model of computation, right? It just models, a kind of very simple computer that just has some finite number of registers, and you can fix some number. Usually people say, for each individual program, maybe the number is different, but once the program is fixed, the number of registers is fixed, and you can, in your mind, think of it as like 5. You have 5 registers, and those registers can contain an arbitrarily large positive integer, right? So it can contain the number 7, it can contain these numbers I've just mentioned, but it can contain, 100 billion or however large you want it to be. And then the program is a list of instructions, but those instructions are of only two types. The first type is take some register, like register 3 or something, take whatever numbers in there, we're going to talk about what numbers they start with, but take whatever is currently in there, add 1, and then go to some other instruction in the list of instructions. All right, so this is one type of instruction, right? It could be take register 3, add 1, and then go to instruction 5. And then instruction 5 is again going to be some instruction that is going to be of that form. So that's one form of instruction. The only other form of instruction is the same but subtract 1. But if it's 0, you can't really subtract 1. So instead of subtracting 1, you do nothing, but then you go to a different state, right? So if you can subtract 1, you do it, and you go to a first state. And if you can't, then you go to a second state. So that's actually kind of a test to see if it's 0. And if it's not 0, you actually change the register, you subtract 1. So the surprising observation was that even for a tiny number of registers, this model of computation is actually really powerful. There are only two types of instructions, right? Add 1 and then go to some other state unconditionally, some other instruction unconditionally, or subtract 1, and if the number was not 0, go to one state, and if it was 0, go to another state. With these two instructions and a small number of registers, I think the theorem says only 2 registers are needed. You can model Turing machines. You can model this universal model of calculation. That's crazy, right? It's not that crazy when you think about it, but at first, at first glance, this seems quite surprising because you only have these 2 kinds of instructions, these very simple, registers, and you only have a small number of them, some finite small number of them. So how does this work? I mean, you can imagine how to add 2 numbers, right? You can add, if you have 2 numbers in registers 1 and 2, then you can, at every step, right, you have a first instruction that says subtract 1 from, the register 2, and go to a state that adds 1 to register 1, and that's if, register 2 is not 0. And then if it's not 0, you start over. You do that in a loop. And then at the end, once you exit the loop, because, the second register is 0, then you have the sum of the 2 numbers in register 1. All right, so we can add 2 numbers, but we kind of lost, the summands. Now they've disappeared. So if you have more registers, you could imagine, you duplicate one of the numbers, which again is easy to imagine how you do that. You add 1, you subtract 1, and maybe you do it in 2 registers. So at the end you have 2 copies, and then you do 2 copies, and then you do the addition, and then you lose one of the copies, but that's okay because you can start over. And now that we've done this, you can sort of see how you do multiplication, which is basically you do addition multiple times, but you need to do the saving operation each time. So it's kind of tedious, but you can see that, okay, we can do multiplication in this kind of tedious way. We can do addition in this kind of tedious way. And we can do these things in a loop. Okay, so if you have addition and multiplication, I've explained this kind of at length in the incompleteness theorem, the incompleteness theorem podcasts. But if you have addition and multiplication, then you can start coding new kinds of things. In particular, you can code pairs of numbers. And if you could code pairs of numbers, you can code triples of numbers. You can repeatedly code pairs. And great, now you have this way in a single register of representing multiple numbers, right, by these codes. These codes are going to be a single number, but you could extract the original pair, right, if you want to. If you're interested in this, this is kind of a clever trick, and I've already explained it a little bit, but you can Google, Gödel encoding pairs or something, And maybe someday I'll explain this in detail. It's just kind of tedious in podcast form because it involves, a lot of basic arithmetic. But yeah, this coding of pairs and triples and tuples is really, really useful. And once you can do that in a loop, you can start encoding more and more complicated things. And then you can start encoding, exponentiation, etc. And then it doesn't seem so surprising that you have the full power of Turing machines. Okay, so as you surely know if you listen to this podcast, once you have the full power of Turing machines, you can express basically any arbitrary computable function, right? You can set the registers at some input, and then you can just ask, what is the result of some arbitrary computation on this input? And we know as well that figuring out what the output will be, or even if the machine is actually going to stop, that's undecidable. There's no way to always determine whether a Turing machine, or in this case, a register machine, is going to halt for a given input. There's no algorithm to do that. Okay, great. So this is well known. This encoding with register machines seems kind of strange, maybe a little bit silly, but it's not too surprising, right? Encodes a computer. We know from the undecidability results that these things, are hard to determine. Great. Known since the 30s. Okay. What Conway did is he invented another kind of game that he called Fracton. Here's how the game goes. You have a list of integers, a vector really, and those integers have to all be positive. That's your starting point. And then you're going to do certain operations to that list. What you're going to do is you're going to take this second fixed list of positive and negative integers. Sorry, it's not a list of positive and negative integers. It's a list of tuples. It's a list of vectors of positive and negative integers. All right. So maybe your starting point is 1, 0, 1, and then your list is -1, 1, -1 or something. And then there's a second element in your list, which is 2, -2, and 0. Okay. Now what you're going to do is you're going to take your starting vector, and then at each coordinate you're going to run down your fixed list of vectors, and if the result would only give you positive numbers, you subtract that list, right, point-wise. And then you start over. You take the first element of that list, such that that operation would only give you positive integers, and then you repeat that operation. Maybe you can see already kind of where I'm going here, which is somehow this is going to be related to the Collatz problem, where you take a thing and you repeat it many times. What Conway noticed, so this is the game, right? You take this input, you go through the list, you do this operation, right, where you take the first one where subtracting it would give you only positive integers, and then you repeat until there is no such element. You can't possibly do this operation and get positive integers. Then you stop, you're done. The question is, can you decide before you start the game whether or not you're eventually going to stop, right? Conway noticed that this could be reduced to the termination of register machines. Basically, you can encode an arbitrary register machine into one of these little games. And the trick here is to add, for each possible instruction, is to add an additional little slot on your initial vector, right? Each kind of position that you're in is going to be one of those slots. And then, a given vector can not only update your registers, but also update one of these slots to tell you what state you're going to be in next. Explaining the details in podcast form, again, is going to be a little bit difficult, so I'm not really going to do it. But you can now start imagining how this thing would play out. And you can now see that if what I said is true, if you can actually encode an arbitrary register machine with one of these games, then you can't really decide whether the game's going to terminate or not in advance, right? You have to play it, and you don't know if that this game of, having a list of integers and subtracting another list of positive or negative integers is the additive form of a multiplicative game, right? And here's the multiplicative game. You take a given modulus, right? You take a given number, say 15, all right? And now for your given start number, you have a start number. And then for each, slots mod 15, you do a different operation. Basically, for 1 mod 15, you do one operation. For 2 mod 15, you do another operation. And you take the first operation in that list that would work. And what is that operation? Well, it's basically you take that number you have, it's an integer, you multiply, if it is, equal to the corresponding slot mod 15, you multiply it by a rational number, basically a fraction. And if the result of that is, again, an integer, right? If it's, in the Collatz problem, you divide by 2, but only if it's even, so you still get an integer as output. So you take the first element of that list, that's the correct modulus, you do the operation, and then you repeat, right? You keep repeating. You take the first element of that list that has the correct modulus, you multiply it by that fraction, and if that's an integer, you do that operation, you continue. If it's not, you go on to the next one on the list. And what's cool here is that this is a much simpler version in some sense than the Collatz problem. It's a generalized version because I'm talking about an arbitrary modulus and I'm talking about arbitrary, multiplications by fractions. But in the Collatz problem, you have this additional element where, you divide by 2 if it's even, and you multiply by 3 if it's odd, but then you add 1. So in some sense, this game given by Conway is much simpler. It doesn't have that addition portion. And it's not a secret that in the Collatz problem, that addition portion makes the problem way, way harder. It's pretty obvious what happens if you don't have that plus 1, right? You divide as long as it's even, right? So if it's a power of 2, you go to 0, right? You go to 1 immediately. And if it's not, if it's odd, you multiply by 3, and that number is still odd. So you keep multiplying by 3 and you go to infinity. But in the generalized case, in the case where you can multiply by an arbitrary fraction, now it turns out to be equivalent to that other game, the fraction game. And how is it equivalent? Well, if you look at a number, right, that's not a list of numbers, but you can turn it into a list of numbers by looking at its prime decomposition. You look at the prime numbers and how it divides that given number, right? So any number is divisible by 2 a certain number of times, and it's divisible by 3 a certain number of times, and it's divisible by 5, right? You take all the primes, and that decomposition of how many times the prime divides it is unique, right? So each number has a unique list associated to it, and it's, the number of times each prime can divide it. And that list, eventually it's all zeros, right? Because the primes go off to infinity. And so, okay, so there's a transformation from this generalized Collatz game, but also simplified, where you don't have this plus 1. There's a transformation from that to the fraction game, where you take lists of numbers and you apply transformations to them. And there's a transformation from that to register machines. And we know that register machines are complicated. We know that they're undecidable in general, or at least it's undecidable to know whether they terminate. And so by following these steps, you know that this generalized Collatz game must be undecidable. It must be, in general, undecidable to know if a generalized Collatz game is going to eventually terminate. And I don't know, that's kind of cool. It tells you at least that this problem is going to have to be hard. Even if you take the simpler version without the plus 1, you generalize it. Now you get this crazy richness already, right? Just from this very simple game. And okay, but so what about the Collatz game? Is that undecidable? There's a subtle point here, which is the Collatz game is determined, right? It's a fixed game. It's not a family of games. So there's no real sense in which the Collatz game can encode, a universal programming language. It's just the one game. Mathematicians tend to think that those things are either true or they're false, right? They can't be undecidable. There's no family of questions, for an algorithm to give a family of answers, right? Here, the answer is either always yes, it does halt for every input, or always no. But there's some philosophical needling here to be done, which I might do in a future podcast. So that was fun. It's pretty easy to Google this stuff. Frackton, John Conway, what he wrote about the Collatz conjecture. Work out the details that I've explained only loosely here. But for now, let's leave it at that. Next time I might talk about another kind of fun subject, which is something called the ontological proof from Gödel. It's this really fascinating philosophical argument that, again, a lot of people have written and talked about, but I feel like it might be fun to go into more detail. But until then, take care.